Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see that this seminar has such a great attendance. I'm really excited. And so first, I'd like to start by acknowledging that most of us are calling today from Vancouver. And we're fortunate and honored to be therefore gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I'd like to introduce Sara Cannon, who's a PhD candidate in UBC's Department of Geography and is also a PhD candidate at the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. She's an exceptional scholar and we're incredibly grateful to have her here today. And she has received a Vanier Scholarship and is a current Ocean Leaders Graduate Fellow. She received her Masters of Science from the same departments in 2017. And before coming to UBC, she studied marine biology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And her PhD work, which is supervised by Simon Donner in the Department of Geography, is done in collaboration with Micronesian scientists and resource managers as well, and employs a range of approaches drawing from biology, ecology, social sciences, with the aim to inform conservation work in the Central Pacific Islands. She's also currently playing a key role as part of an exciting project that is being led by Andrea Reed in collaboration with Margot Hessing-Lewis and Sarah Harper, as well as myself, which is entitled Full Circle, and which aims to support and develop future university and local leadership through a course on Indigenous research by means of community-centered learning and engagement. So please, Sarah, take the floor.
Thank you so much, Colette. And thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Before I started, I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. So I'm a settler who grew up on the Chesapeake Bay in what is now called Southern Maryland in the United States, on the lands of the Susquehannock and Piscataway peoples. My undergraduate degree, like Colette said, was in marine biology, and my coursework was focused heavily on conservation biology and applications. But my research today is focusing on the intersections of global and local threats to coral reefs in Micronesia. And so I've been working in Micronesia since 2012, when I had the opportunity to work with an organization called One People, One Reef, which is a group of scientists and local people who are doing really great work to co-lead conservation initiatives in the outer islands of Yap in the Federated States of Micronesia. Even though my undergraduate degree focused really heavily on conservation, when I started graduate school at the University of British Columbia, I hadn't heard of or engaged with any of the literature that critiqued conservation science and its approaches. So I only really began to learn about those critiques by chance when I started working as a teaching assistant for human geography courses. And I was really surprised at what I was learning and distressed that I hadn't been aware of these critiques already, especially since at that point, I'd already been working with local communities in Micronesia. And I had seen some of the dynamics that the literature discusses playing out, not with One People, One Reef, but with other groups who worked in the region. And I didn't really have the basic knowledge or framework of understanding that I needed in order to process and to make sense of it, especially with the local and historical contexts. So I want to emphasize that none of what I'm talking about today is directly the topic of my dissertation research. I'm sharing some of what I've learned through my journey to educate myself because I care deeply about this, as I'm sure all of you do, about making sure that the work that we do is useful, applicable, and effective, but especially that it's not causing harm to anyone, especially the people that we are hoping our work will help. And I also spent a lot of time learning about this because I want to incorporate it into my own research, and in an attempt to make sure that I'm being accountable to the people that I work with in Micronesia and also here in Canada. But because this isn't my dissertation research, I don't consider myself an expert, and I know that I have a lot of learning to do. And so many of you will probably know about more about these examples than I do. So just to give a quick overview of what I want to talk about today, I'm going to start by reviewing the history of conservation, beginning with why it is important, and then sharing how the concepts of nature were created, not something that exists independent of people. I'm also going to talk about the conservation movement and where it comes from, and identify the assumptions that are built into the structures of conservation as a whole and how they continue to shape the field today. Then I want to give some examples of conservation that I hope can illustrate those assumptions and how they might inadvertently cause harm, particularly if we're not aware of them or their origins. And I'll start with two historical examples, and then I'll move into more contemporary examples that many of you are probably familiar with. And then finally, I'm going to end by tying all this together, hopefully, to show how learning these things can help us to continue to challenge our assumptions going forward so that we can stop repeating these same mistakes and can make conservation more fair and just, in addition to more effective. So why should we care about this? Well, natural scientists, and particularly those of us who are not Indigenous, have a responsibility to understand and engage with the history of the field, including the histories of the places where we work and the assumptions that underlie conservation as a whole, in order to understand how the harms of those assumptions can be embedded into our practices today. So for example, the fact that I was able to graduate with a marine biology degree and with experience doing conservation work without knowing any of the history of how conservation has been used to continue to harm and oppress specific groups of people is deeply problematic. And I'll talk about where those assumptions come from and how they are still harming people today and how they can undermine both Indigenous sovereignty and conservation outcomes. And whether we work directly in conservation or whether our work aims to inform conservation, we need to be thinking about the history and context of conservation as a whole. And before I move on, I just want to give everyone a quick warning that I will mention some difficult material about Indigenous genocide and violence against local Indigenous peoples in this talk. And sadly, I don't think it's possible to talk about the history or the current state of conservation and the harm it can and does cause without including these realities. So more and more, we're learning that Indigenous-led conservation is more effective than top-down conservation approaches led by people who are not local to the places they're trying to protect. However, I want to emphasize that this is a benefit of supporting Indigenous sovereignty, but it is not the reason why we need to support Indigenous sovereignty through conservation work. Instead, we should be supporting Indigenous-led conservation and Indigenous sovereignty because it's fundamentally unethical to impose Western values of any kind onto Indigenous peoples, and any attempt to do so is racist and colonial. Indigenous peoples are currently responsible for managing almost 40 million square kilometers in 87 countries. And although they make up only about 6% of the global population, Indigenous communities are responsible for about 40% of terrestrial protected areas and ecologically intact landscapes around the world. In Canada, Australia, and Brazil, Indigenous managed lands have equal or higher biodiversity than protected areas. And so Indigenous-led conservation is at least equally, but possibly more beneficial for biodiversity than strict protected areas. And it's also more effective in terms of benefits to local communities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. In fact, global conservation efforts might not be possible without Indigenous peoples because of the huge amount of biodiversity that they're protecting already. So this photo is a giant clam farm in one of the communities that I worked with in Micronesia with the group One People, One Reef. This is a traditional management technique that allows, that helps to replenish the giant clam populations for subsistence. And biodiversity conservation is integral, especially today. And I think everyone who's here already knows this, so I'm not planning on spending much time on it. But as we know, we're facing unprecedented threats to global ecosystems, from climate change, deforestation, pollution, overexploitation, and those are just a few examples. Some scientists say that we are in the midst of the sixth mass extinction, or the Anthropocene extinction. Almost 500 species have been declared extinct over the last 10 years, and these are just the ones that we are aware of. And as many as 1 million species are currently at risk of extinction, including 40% of all amphibian species, 33% of corals, and 10% of insects. So the situation is truly dire, and this means that conservation is more important today than it has ever been. And again, I know that everyone here is already familiar with this and you don't need convincing, but I just want to stress that while my talk is largely critical of current conservation practices, I'm not arguing that we should be doing away with conservation as a whole. But what I'm saying is that we need to do it more responsibly and make sure that as people engaged in conservation or people who are engaged in fields of research that we hope to inform conservation, we make sure that we don't allow the harms to Indigenous peoples to continue because of or in the name of our work. So in Western societies, when we think of nature, we think of it as something that is separate or apart from people. And nature in a Western worldview does not usually include people or things that are built by people. But this is a conceptualization of nature that is not universal, and many cultures would not agree that natures and humans are separate. During the early stages of settler colonialism in North America, for example, Westerners thought of North America as a vast wilderness. And this understanding of land and nature and wilderness is the part of the mindset that continues to excuse colonialism today. So for example, there's a legal term, terra nullius, which is Latin for empty land, that was codified into Canadian law and gave settlers the ability to claim ownership of lands that were empty. From a settler perspective, at the time, Indigenous peoples in North America weren't using the land, but we know that that wasn't true. Indigenous peoples managed the environments in North America in ways that non-Indigenous people are still just beginning to understand. And one example of this is the ways that Indigenous people manage forests to keep them healthy and to manage fires. So many conservation narratives today still tend to perpetuate this idea of nature as being separate from people, whereas in reality, humans are and have always been a part of the ecosystems in which we live. So the goal of conservation is to protect wilderness or nature from being harmed by humans, or to restore natural ecosystems to what they were before people caused harm. And conservation biology is the scientific arm of conservation movement. It emerged in the 1980s, and it seeks to preserve biological diversity. But when Europeans arrived and in other places of the world, they made incorrect assumptions of about what the natural ecosystem was, some of which I'll talk about still underlie the choices that we make in conservation today. And we like to think about our choices as being driven by science. After all, we're taught as scientists that our science is objective. But in actuality, conservation is based on values about whose access to resources matter and who can be sacrificed for the greater good, values about cultural norms, and values that define nature as pristine and separate from people, and decide which aspects of nature are worthy of protecting. So fortress conservation is a term that is used to describe conservation that excludes people from certain areas or ecosystems in order to protect them. And this is an approach that has been critiqued by the conservation social sciences for decades, but I haven't heard much discussion of it in conservation science. It's something that natural scientists need to be thinking and talking about because, again, it can be harmful for Indigenous or local peoples. And in Canada, we're starting to move away from this approach toward parks that are co-managed with Indigenous peoples and include in traditional activities. But we still have lots of work to do. But here, at least, I think people are still starting to think about this. And it's largely thanks to Indigenous peoples fighting for their rights. But fortress conservation remains the norm in many parts of the world. So in India, for example, a study found that about 13,500 people were displaced from 26 protected areas in just the last decade. And in many places, conservation is also becoming more militarized, meaning either military forces or rangers that are trained in military tactics are involved in enforcing protected areas. In some cases, they're even authorized to shoot to kill. Militarization has been funded by major environmental nonprofits. So in 2020, the World Wildlife Fund and the World Conservation Society were both implicated in human rights abuses in Africa and Asia, which after investigation led to the US Department of Interior removing some of their government funding. And importantly, neither of these approaches address the underlying social causes that could drive the actions that people take that might harm the environment. And they also prevent Indigenous peoples from participating in traditional management, cultural or subsistence activities, and can subject Indigenous communities to violence and abuse. So conservation in North America followed the European model of nature parks, which began in the US and expanded to Canada. When conservation first emerged in the early 20th century, it was closely tied to white supremacy and eugenics movements. And white supremacy is the ideology that the white race is superior to all other races, and eugenics was the pseudoscientific arm of the movement. Eugenicists use social Darwinism to advocate for controlling human populations of anyone that they considered undesirable, which is code for anyone who was not white, to protect parts of the environment that they decided were worth protecting. And this was a common belief in the time among elites in North America and Europe. It was not niche even among scientists. Many of them viewed eugenics as an application of the theory of evolution. Many of the originators of the conservation movement were white supremacists that were active in the eugenics movement. So for example, Henry Fairfield Osborn was the founder of the New York Zoological Society, which later became the Wildlife Conservation Society. And he was also president of the American Museum of Natural History for 25 years. He was one of the founders of the American Eugenics Society. Madison Grant was one of the founders of the Bronx Zoo, and he wrote the white supremacist book, The Passing of the Great Race, in 1909, that Hitler was reportedly a fan of. President Teddy Roosevelt wrote a letter to Grant praising him for the book, and Osborn wrote the foreword for the book. The first head of the National Conservation Commission and of the National Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, he was appointed by Teddy Roosevelt, and he was an active member of the American Eugenics Society as well, and he was on their advisory board. He's often known as the first conservationist. John Muir was not openly active in the eugenics movement, but he did have racist views, and he was friends with people in this group. And as many of you know, he went on to found the Sierra Club, the first national environmental organization in the United States. Other early leaders of the Sierra Club after Muir were active in the eugenics movement. And in the 1920s and 30s, these same principles of protecting the environment from undesirable aspects of human populations led to some US states passing sterilization laws, thanks in part to effort from prominent ecologists and conservationists, including Aldo Leopold and William Vogt. And blaming overpopulation for environmental problems is still common today, without any critical engagement about which aspects of the population use the most resources. As an example, you can take a look at the newest David Attenborough documentary on Netflix. And another example today is the nonprofit Blue Venture in Madagascar, who supported the access to birth control as a means of conservation. And access to birth control is a good thing, but the reasoning and language around relating birth control to conservation goes back to the foundations of conservation and its ties to the eugenics movement. And I also wanted to note that all of the world's largest environmental organizations are still majority white today, and people of color are even less represented if we look to the leadership of those organizations. So these are questions that I think are helpful for beginning to challenge some of the assumptions that we might hold that can inform our views about conservation approaches. Specifically, as I go forward and share some examples, I would like if we could think about how each of them define nature and natural, and which activities were allowed or excluded, and also whose conservation action was meant to benefit and who paid the price for it. And finally, how much of each example was driven by science and how much was driven by values, and whose values were the ones that were considered important. So I want to give two historical examples of how colonialism and Western concepts of nature combine to create these misguided conservation approaches. Both of the examples illustrate how conservation was informed by white supremacy and misguided perceptions of nature. So I'm going to start with Yosemite National Park, which many of you know about or have visited in the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California. Before colonialism, multiple culturally distinct indigenous groups called the Yosemite area home, and the valley had a population of about 3,000 people that lived there year-round. They managed the local ecosystem through controlled burning, horticulture, and other techniques. In the 19th century, the indigenous communities in Yosemite were decimated by settler populations that brought disease, murdered the local people, or forced them to flee the area for their lives. And this violence against the indigenous communities was sanctioned by the state of California. By the time John Muir arrived in 1868, the population was a small fraction of what it had been. And what he called God's empty lands was actually the product of thousands of years of environmental management by Native American peoples. Yosemite officially became a national park in 1890, in no small part due to John Muir's efforts to protect it. The park allowed the surviving Native American peoples to continue living there in restricted communities and use them as a tourist draw for tourists who came looking for an authentic wilderness experience. But the park prevented them from any traditional activities, including hunting, gathering, or environmental management or horticulture, which they had excused under the guise of preventing human intervention. And this was a common practice in North American parks. The original inhabitants of the land were forced to move so that the reality could conform with this fantasy of an untouched wilderness. But despite the claim that human intervention was not allowed, some activities were clearly excused in the park in the name of the park's management and tourism. For example, the park cut down trees to improve views of the valley. They built roads and railroads to bring in tourists and built lodges and campgrounds for the tourists to stay in once they arrived. They built garbage dumps and garbage incinerators and would also feed garbage to the bears as a way to attract them for the tourists. And if you've ever visited Yosemite, you know that even now you can't leave any food at all, even like sandwich crust or a granola bar in your car, because you might attract a bear. So this has had long-lasting consequences on wildlife. The park also killed some predators so that there would be more wild game for tourists to view. So this wilderness that national parks like Yosemite had advertised and promised to share with the public had to first be created by these interventions and then restricting the freedom of indigenous peoples who had lived there. And this pristine wilderness didn't exist otherwise. In Africa, when Europeans arrived, they viewed it as a paradise, a Garden of Eden, and a place where wilderness and untouched nature could be seen in its true form. So this quote is from an advertisement for the Selous Game Reserve in Tanzania. It says, "The Selous Game Reserve is the largest wilderness reserve in all of Africa, much of it totally unexplored, and by unexplored, they mean by Europeans. It is remote and peaceful, but more importantly, it is the true Africa, undamaged and unspoilt." But prior to colonialism, cattle herding was a traditional activity throughout parts of the African continent, and it provided both subsistence for indigenous peoples and controlled growth of thickets, which limited the population of the tsetse fly. In Tanzania in the early 1900s, indigenous peoples in what is now the Selu Game Reserve revolted against German colonists, who responded by deliberately starving them. The German colonists murdered as much as 1/3 of the total population in the area, burning villages and destroying food crops. And the people who survived were later forcibly removed when the game reserve was officially created in 1922. The colonizers also brought diseases with them to Africa, which decimated the human populations. But unlike in North America, the diseases also killed cattle and wildlife. And 2/3 of the Maasai people died from a plague, and it also killed 90 to 95% of all cattle throughout the entire continent of Africa. The wildlife recovered quickly and the population sizes became huge. They were unprecedented, and this was because of the lack of competition from humans and cattle. The habitat destruction from the lack of management also allowed the tsetse fly to flourish, which caused further devastation to people in other parts of Africa. And between 1902 and 1906, 200,000 people died in Uganda alone because of the tsetse fly. So when tourism businesses advertise natural parks in Africa as being true, undamaged, and unspoiled nature, this assumption is based on the view of ecosystems that were actually created as a result of colonialism and genocide. So now I want to switch gears a bit to some more recent examples, which some of you are probably familiar with already. And these, I hope, will show how keeping the history of conservation in mind can highlight how white supremacy is built into the structures of conservation as a field or as a movement, and this still persists today. Specifically, these examples show how colonial values and ideas of nature, what is worthy of protection, and who should have access to resources and for what, can drive conservation approaches, and how this language of conservation can be utilized by colonial powers to maintain control. So the Migmal people are one of the original people that are home to what we now call Atlantic Canada, Quebec, and Maine. In 1760, the peace and friendship treaties were agreed upon by First Nations in the region and the British. And these treaties codified First Nations rights to harvest fish, wildlife, fruit, and berries that would support the moderate livelihood for treaty beneficiaries. This treaty is still in effect today. In 1999, the Canadian Supreme Court of Canada issued the Marshall Decision, which upheld the rights of the Migmal to fish for moderate livelihoods outside of the DFO's regulated season, per the 1760 treaties. They also issued a second decision that gave the DFO the right to limit the fishery in the name of conservation. But if this was the case, they had to consult with the First Nations before they imposed those restrictions. It's now been over 20 years since the Marshall Decision and over 250 years since the peace and friendship treaties. In 2020, the Migmal decided that they were not going to wait for the DFO to issue them licenses any longer, and they made a plan to regulate the fishery themselves. The DFO has refused to recognize this as a legal fishery, and they still have not agreed to either issue licenses or to recognize the licenses that were issued by the Migmal as legitimate. The Migmal Nation issued 7 licenses, but only 3 were being used within the last year. And each of these licenses allowed 50 traps, so there would have been a maximum of 150 traps. But the commercial fishery in that zone, which is much bigger than the St. Mary's Bay, allows for up to 390,000 traps. So the non-Indigenous lobster fishermen have been protesting the Migmal fishery, often violently, and they claim that they are worried about the conservation status of the fishery. But DFO and other experts in the fishery have said that the lobster stocks are healthy. And also the historical context here is really important. This controversy isn't new. Indigenous people throughout North America have been forced to fight government regulators for access to their traditional fishery rights for over 50 years, and I'm sure long before that. So for example, in the 1960s, the fish wars were conflicts over fishing rights between the Fish and Wildlife Service and Indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. And the salmon wars were a similar conflict in Quebec between Indigenous peoples and the DFO in the 1980s. Just a couple weeks ago, a Migmal woman, a lobster harvester, received a threatening video that included racial slurs and gunshots. People's vehicles and boats were set on fire, and lines to lobster traps have been cut by non-Indigenous fishermen, and the lobster pound where lobster were processed was burned down and destroyed. So this is an example of how conservation can be used as an excuse to keep Indigenous people from accessing their resources. But it's also an example of how conservation can be used as an excuse for white supremacist violence. And I'd argue that people working in conservation science or doing science that aim to inform conservation have a responsibility to call out when we see people using the language of our field for racism. So the next case study I want to share is a no-take protected area that surrounds the Chagos archipelago, a group of islands near Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. The Mauritians consider it a part of Mauritius, although it's controlled by the United Kingdom. In 2006, world governments at the Convention on Biological Diversity made a commitment to protect at least 10% of each of the world's oceans by 2012. The Chagos Environmental Network, an association of scientific and conservation groups that was led by the Chagos Conservation Trust and the Pew Environmental Group, proposed making the Chagos Archipelago a no-take MPA in 2007 to contribute to this goal. The effort was supported by many of the world's largest groups working in marine conservation, including the IUCN. In 2010, the UK officially announced the creation of the MPA, making it the largest no-take area in the world at the time. This region is home to the world's cleanest, most pristine waters, and it has at least 220 species of coral and over 1,000 species of fish. 275,000 citizens in the UK signed on to support the creation of the MPA during public consultations. And on the surface, this all sounds great. It's exciting to see such a large biodiverse area being protected. And indeed, lots of people celebrated this as a big win for marine conservation. So this is a quote from an academic who supported the MPA. He says, "The Chagos archipelago represents a magnificent conservation opportunity that could be of lasting benefit to humanity. What is needed is vision and a leadership initiative by Britain to create the Chagos as an iconic, pristine area that is held in trust for the future of the world community." So I'd like you to please keep these underlined sections in mind, along with the question of who is conservation for, as I share more information about the background of the Chagos Marine Protected Area and its history. So what I showed before was not the whole story, although it is the one that the most people in our field are familiar with. None of the materials about establishing the MPA discussed either of two key issues that made this a major international controversy. First, the UK had forcibly removed the Chagosian people from the Chagos in the 1960s. And second, the US has an airbase in the Chagos on Diego Garcia, dating back to the 1970s. Mauritius, including the Chagos archipelago, was governed by the UK until 1965, when the UK separated the Chagos from the rest of its territory to form the British Indian Ocean Territory, and then Mauritius became independent 3 years later in 1968. The US built a military base on Diego Garcia in 1971, displacing about 1,500 Chagosians who lived in the archipelago after the United States agreed to give the UK a discount on Polaris missiles. If we fast forward to 2009, the UK announced the creation of the no-take MPA in the news and to go into effect in 2010. The Mauritian government says that was the first it had heard of the MPA being a no-take area. They say they have discussed the potential of the MPA with the government of the UK, and they were assured that their traditional fishing rights would be protected. And Chagosians saw the MPA as preventing them from returning home because they wouldn't be able to fish to feed themselves. The Mauritius government felt that the MPA consultations should include discussion of the transfer of sovereignty back to them and eventual resettlement of the Chagosians. And although the UK public consultation responses showed strong public support for the park, the information that the UK had shared with the public did not include information about the opposition from Mauritius and the Chagosian people. Instead, it gave the impression that the Mauritians had welcomed the proposal and claimed that the MPA would have no direct immediate impact on Chagosians. But later, UK government documents were uncovered by WikiLeaks that showed that the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office officials had explicitly hoped that the MPA would put resettlement claims to rest, thanks to the environmental lobby, which they said, quote, was far more powerful than the Chagosians' advocates. So anyone included in the term environmental lobby, such as Pew or the IUCN, should be angry about this because they were used as a tool to allow the UK to retain control of an occupied territory. And this document makes it clear that the British government had geopolitical motivations for creating the MPA, and the claims that its establishment was driven by science was a way to use the conservation movement as an excuse to keep the Chagos under the UK's control. On January 28th, so just over a week ago, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea issued a ruling that affirmed Mauritian sovereignty over the territorial sea of the Chagos and rights and jurisdiction over the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf. And as far as I know, the US and UK have yet to say how or if they intend to comply. I don't know a lot about international law, and I'm not sure what the next steps will be, but for the purposes of this talk, I think it's enough to recognize that the UK used conservation as an excuse with the support of major conservation organizations to continue its colonial control of the Chagos archipelago. And one uniting theme across all of these examples is that while these projects claim that their aim is to minimize human impact on the environment, once we look a little bit deeper, some human activity is almost always allowed or encouraged, and it is almost always activities that are beneficial to the groups in power, which tend to be Western, who are imposing restrictions on local or indigenous peoples. And this is colonialism in action. So in this case, building the military base on Diego Garcia required extreme manipulation of the environment, in particular dredging the lagoon and the coral reef to create sediments that fortified the islands to make space for the airstrip and other improvements. And some scientists have said that this damage is irreversible. The impacts are almost certainly more extreme and more harmful to the local environment than allowing the Chagosian people to return home and operate a subsistence fishery. And some scientists did publicly object to the protected area and pointed out its weaknesses, calling it a paper park, and highlighting how the park is an example of fortress conservation. Specifically, the military base on Diego Garcia and the 3 nautical miles territorial sea surrounding it was excluded from the protected area. And even though this was the only area that had evidence of overfishing to begin with, so any MPA that excludes it would likely not address one of the main problems. The other threat to marine ecosystems in the Chagos is illegal fishing, and it's also not addressed by the MPA because there is minimal funding for enforcement. So this is why it's been called a paper park. The claim is that it protects ecosystems on paper, but it doesn't seem to make a material difference, at least according to these critiques. And again, I think that many of you all probably know more about this example than I do. So given all of these examples, I want to come back to the questions that I raised earlier in the talk that I hope we can use to challenge some of the assumptions that we hold when we think about conservation. And I have to wonder if the natural scientists involved in each of these examples had asked themselves these questions, and if they were aware of the history of colonialism and conservation, if it would have changed the actions that they took. As natural scientists, we're not taught to think about these things. Instead, we're taught that we're supposed to be objective observers who are above being influenced by things like our personal values. But in the field of conservation, that is a fallacy because the very concept of nature itself is value driven. And we need to recognize as a field that environmental problems don't happen in a vacuum. They are driven and informed by the contexts, both historical and current, and understanding this and the steps forward requires engaging with the history. So we now know that conservation is less effective when it is done without leadership from local or indigenous peoples. And given the urgency of our current environmental crisis, we can't put off having these conversations any longer. We have to confront them so that we can learn from them and move forward. So these are some of the things that I've learned about how those of us who are not Indigenous can seek to move forward in a more informed and just way. These are just a start, and I personally have a lot to learn. So I'd love to hear from all of you about how or more different ways that we can do this. First and foremost, those of us who are not Indigenous should be centering the wants and needs of local Indigenous communities. And to do that, we need to look to Indigenous leaders. Sometimes those values might be different from the values that I hold personally, and I might have a different idea of what conservation looks like or the goals of a given conservation project. But I'm working on recognizing that my views are not the most important, and they're also not the most informed, particularly when it comes to working with people who have been caretakers of their traditional and ancestral territories for generations. This also requires an understanding that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to conservation. Indigenous and local communities are diverse in many ways, and their priorities and needs will also be diverse. And when we question our biases and assumptions, it will help us to identify where we might be imposing Western values on other people, at least to some extent. This requires that we take the time and initiative to learn about the histories of the places where we're working and the context of the various conservation approaches. We also should be wary of sweeping goals that aim to set aside huge amounts of resources for protection, because that can erase or obscure the people who might be affected on a more local scale. And in some cases, there could be multiple groups of people with diverse needs within these regions. We also need to actively promote, participate in, and choose conservation approaches that support Indigenous sovereignty and resource management. So in the case of the Chagos archipelago, this could have looked like discussions about protecting the ocean that included resettlement of the Chagosian people and returning the region to Mauritius. In Nova Scotia, it would mean supporting the moderate livelihood fishery. But we should not be doing conservation work on Indigenous lands and waters without at least co-creating the projects with the original inhabitants of these lands. So our approaches can't be top-down. There's been a big push for including traditional ecological knowledge in science for decades now. But as much as I think that recognizing the value of TEK is important, I personally don't think it's enough to only recognize it in relation to Western science. So this is extractive, and it doesn't recognize or respect the sacred nature that this knowledge can hold to the people who hold it. And it also perpetuates a hierarchy of knowledge by presuming that we have to make traditional and local knowledge fit within a Western scientific framework, when instead we need to build something new that incorporates both so they can complement different aspects of the other. So as an example, Dr. Andrea Reed, who's from the Nisga'a Nation, gave a talk last semester about a framework for bringing together scientific ecological knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge that she calls two-eyed seeing. And I'd highly recommend that you watch her talk if you weren't able to be here. It's available on the IOF YouTube channel. And finally, I recommend that we all take the initiative to learn to do better. One way to do this would be to join a discussion group such as the one that meets once a week in the zoology department. And there are so many opportunities for non-Indigenous peoples to listen and learn from Indigenous folks now, particularly here at UBC, which I'm grateful for. For example, I wanted to shout out a talk that happened on Wednesday at the Biodiversity Research Center about decolonizing conservation by Deborah McGregor, who's an associate professor in Indigenous environmental justice at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. You can request a copy of the recording from the BRC's event website, or send me an email and I can forward you a link to it. So originally I'd planned to end with some case studies of conservation projects that are led by people who are Indigenous. But as I was putting this presentation together and thinking about what I should include, I felt weird about making decisions about which approaches are the best. Any recommendations that I make, including the ones that I have made already, are undoubtedly informed by my own biases. So instead, I'd like to recommend that all of us who are not Indigenous listen to local and Indigenous folks about the approaches that they find have worked for them and their communities, and so that we can ensure that our blind spots aren't keeping us from seeing anything that could be harmful. And again, the most successful approaches are likely going to be different for every community. I also want to make sure I'm clear about the difference between following Indigenous leadership on one hand and expecting Indigenous folks to educate us on the other hand. We can't expect Indigenous peoples to educate us about colonialism and its harms. There are tons of materials out there that we can use to educate ourselves. And so with that in mind, I want to direct you to this resource I created, a reading list that I had created specifically for this purpose, to help non-Indigenous folks like me working in natural scientists to educate ourselves about how our efforts to protect ecosystems, no matter how well-intentioned they may be, could inadvertently cause harm. And doing this will allow us to work towards truly being able to listen and support Indigenous conservation and sovereignty. The list is crowdsourced, so people from all over the world have shared recommendations, and it includes some examples of conservation projects that were led or co-led by Indigenous peoples. And if you have any resources that you think would be good additions to the list, I hope you'll send them to me. I'll also share my contact info at the end of the talk, which is now. So a huge thank you to all of you for being here and to all of the wonderful people who very patiently and generously helped me to plan this presentation. I'd be happy to share the slideshow and the references for anyone who's interested. So feel free to send me an email or check out the reading list because many of the references come from there. I'm happy to try to answer questions now if people have them.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. Yes, and I wish
you.
that we were in the auditorium at IOF, because then we could give you a loud, rousing round of applause. So I'm going to do that for all of us now.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for that, for stepping forward and giving this really important talk today. I have some questions myself, but I see that there's already quite a bit of momentum that was generated in the chat. And so I will turn briefly to Andrea first, and then we'll turn to Amanda after that, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you again so much for me, at least for now.
Thank you.
Wonderful job, Sarah. And I just really want to commend you for engaging with challenging and difficult material and putting yourself in that uncomfortable position. It's a hard line to toe, and you've done it really well. And you've done a really great job illustrating for us how science can be so values driven with some really concrete examples. So I really enjoyed that, as much as the material itself can be really sobering at times. Part of what you shared really reminds me of Sheila Jasanoff's work on the technologies of humility. And so I just wanted to put that out there so folks could take a look at that 2007 Nature paper. And it's really worth a read because it asks, how much do we need to know before we act, and how do we position our science, and who benefits? And it's a really thought-provoking piece. My question for you relates to your wonderful decolonial reading list that's, as you say, now in 3 languages, and that has been covered by Vice and Nature and various outlets. There's kind of a tension in the world around decolonial literature in terms of the global North and the global South. And I'm just curious about, in that list, which I've seen before, but I haven't sunk my teeth into this part of it, just is the South leading the charge in this conversation, and does the North need to pay a little bit more attention to the work that's already been done, and the thinking that's been put in place for us?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I do think that, yes, that is true, that we do need to be paying more attention to work that comes out of the global South. And there are some papers in the list that talk about that. But because there are a lot of recommendations there, and because most of the literature comes from the global North, I think it's still, it's not there yet. But I've tried to kind of highlight, it's funny because even something like making a reading list, we try to think of it, or I tended to think about it as being objective, because you're just listing the resources that are there, but the actions of choosing what to include are political in a sense. So I've tried to kind of highlight the literature specifically that talks about that issue, but it's something that I could probably do better. And that's why I've also tried to emphasize that I would like people who are including or sending resources to me to try to send things that are written specifically by Indigenous peoples. I should also expand that to include people from the global South more broadly.
Yeah, and it wasn't even meant as a critique in any way. It's more just a thought around, when we're talking about science, we're often talking about English, and that's already privileging certain people, certain dimensions. Anyway, so just food for thought, but well done, and I'll be happy to pass the mic over to Amanda.
Thank you.
Yeah, Sara, that was splendid, absolutely splendid. So thank you so very much. And I'm churning over quite a bit of it. Some of it I was familiar with, some of it definitely not. So that was great. I'll have to talk to you at length when I've let my thoughts settle a bit. But one of the things that I'm just wanting to work with is the extension of this. So you've referred to it as the relationship with Indigenous people, and that's being your focus in this talk, which is, of course, critically important. But then we also have, of course, coastal peoples or small scale fishers, or, there's a whole host of communities engaged with ocean resources in a variety of ways. And the concerns you've expressed have to be extended into the work that involves them. And then it gets a little more challenging in many ways, as if it weren't challenging enough, because many coastal peoples actually don't necessarily themselves have a long relationship with the coast. Many people, as you know, migrate to the coast as an occupation of last resort, or they may, for a variety of reasons, not really have a long-standing relationship and may themselves not have a particular commitment to the ocean. In fact, many people work on trawl boats, for example, as Roshni's discovering, because they migrated there out of desperation and were hired laborers. So it'll be really interesting to see how these thoughts actually also apply in that extremely complex situation where who actually has, it might be a small subsection of any community that has the long-standing relationship with the ocean. And then, of course, my thoughts, maybe we should avoid just assuming this is global North and global South. And I know you've reflected on this, because where you have long-standing coastal relations like Newfoundland, for example, there's also the imposition of centralized government decision-making on Newfoundland outports and all of their relationship with the sea. So I'm not sure I have a question as much as just sort of your thoughts about where we would go with this really critical subject and expanding it to be generally more respectful and more inclusive and more consultative.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And thank you for raising that. I didn't want to get too much into distinguishing between Indigenous people and local peoples in the talk, just because it can be really complicated, like you said. But the example of the Chagos is a good example because the Chagosian people are not actually indigenous to those islands. They were brought there as enslaved people by the French to work on coconut plantations. And they did develop a culture, an inter-island Creole culture throughout the archipelago, but they're not indigenous in the same way that people indigenous to North America would be, in the sense that they co-evolved along with their environments for generations and tens of thousands of years. And so in that case, there are not two different groups of people. There's only the Chagosian people who had lived there and were expelled, so that there's not conflicting interests there. But it is an important thing to distinguish between, I think, and I don't really have, an answer for the best way to consider different groups of people and their rights and resources, and how to make sure that, especially marginalized peoples who were brought, like you said, kind of forcibly moved because of circumstances, how to make sure that they're not being carried or further oppressed and carrying burdens as well.
I think
Yeah.
probably
So anyway, I don't have any.
The final thought is, I thought probably what it comes down to is just don't assume anything, but ask a lot of questions and be very willing to listen as we try to mine down to understand the actual situation in which we're engaged.
Totally. And there's probably a lot of people in the audience who could speak more to that as well. I know we have a lot of people here today, but we had talked about possibly opening it up for discussion instead of questions. And that was part of the reason why, because again, I don't consider myself an expert on this. And we have a lot of expertise in our department that we could talk about this more broadly.
So perhaps to segue into there are a couple of questions, so we might take them, but yeah, maybe because there was a sort of broader question, maybe we can see if there are a couple of people who would like to chime in or provide an additional perspective, or to touch on what you brought up, Sarah.
Sure.
I'm gonna chime in here. Sarah, great talk, and yeah, really tricky subject to handle and grasp and communicate as well. As someone who's been trying to understand the values of multiple communities occupying the same space, including indigenous fishers and commercial fishers with varying histories of settlement in a space, it is complicated. Understanding whose rights, whose values related to fisheries and marine systems need to be privileged, accounted for, and prioritized. And so I think some of the work that UBC and the IOF and the work that Mimi is doing, Mimi Lam and Tony Pitcher, and kind of some more of the work that the approach that conservation is taking towards understanding human values and priorities is kind of working in that direction to further to kind of answer that difficult question as to how do we negotiate and navigate whose rights matter in these systems. But again, and this is also where the whole blue justice focus is kind of going, where again, using a decolonizing approach, privileging the values of people who have been marginalized through colonialism. So I'd say that there is potentially a good space for you to link this decolonizing approach towards with blue justice. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Could I barge in here?
Please go ahead.
I just liked excellent talk, and I'd like to build on the comments that Amanda Vincent made, which is how to include other coastal people who have a long-term commitment to the resource, and often at least 3 generations, sometimes more, of occupation and participation in commercial fishing. We have an example on the west coast of Vancouver Island right here, where there's a round table that includes those voices and is working toward a more inclusive co-management system. And I think, the challenge, as Amanda mentions, is how do you decide, or how do you think about whose voices should be included? And I think we have a number of choices here. One is long-term dependence and dedication to the resource, long-term residence. Another is contribution to management. For example, many long-term, or when I say long-term, I mean like 3 generations, which isn't obviously the indigenous time frame. But there are many communities where local fishermen have been doing enhancement activities as volunteers, have been collecting data, contributing data. So we could think of, one way of thinking about what the activities of such local communities should be is, what are they contributing as volunteers? What are they contributing to management and knowledge? What are they sharing? Because they too have long-term local knowledge. So I'll stop there, but it is a very complex topic, and I thank you for your wonderful contribution. There's also a wonderful example you might want to include in your research, which is Uluru National Park in Australia, which is a positive example in that after the Indigenous people were kicked out for, I think it was 20 years, they were invited back in because the Australian government, or the National Parks Agency, recognized that the species they were trying to save by kicking people out were dying, because they almost lost all of the mammals, all of a certain kind of mammals, because the Indigenous people weren't doing controlled burning of the spinifex of the grass. And so that example contributes a positive occasion when governments finally recognized that what they were doing wasn't achieving their own goals, because they hadn't recognized that Indigenous people co-evolved with all of the animals and plants, and that their controlled burning activities made the survival of those very species possible. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'll make sure I read more about that. That sounds really interesting.
I'll send you some stuff on it.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Andres, I don't know if you want to touch specifically on that, or you had a question, but you've been raising your hand for a little while, so I just wanted to turn to you.
I just had a question. Sara, awesome talk. And this is kind of from what like Andrea and Amanda were talking about before, but it was related to this. So obviously you focused on the talk on the kind of sort of Indigenous related issues, right? And, as Andrea mentioned, there's also a lot of like kind of north-south inequities that have happened. And I was just wondering, I agree with what you said, right? There's like a ton of literature on that. And I think most of us like on the call who are from like former colonial countries, there's a ton of literature in our own language. And it's just, we're all very aware of the issues that you're talking about. But I was actually really interested in seeing if that has come into the English literature on this. Right, because I am very familiar with a lot of the issues with indigeneity, or more recent examples where clear laws were broken, sort of identifiable people have injustices done to them. But obviously, when we talk about north-south, a lot of it's very harder to pinpoint, right? Like no laws are broken in like neoliberalism for the most part, but it's still an injustice and stuff. And I'm just wondering how much that's crossed over, right? Like I was trying to think like, is there anything that I know that I know for sure? Like the only book I can think of is The Open Veins of Latin America, if anybody's heard of that one. Eduardo Galeano. It's like one of the only ones that I can think, like most people in English probably would have read that book. But besides that, is there a lot in the literature right now on this subject that kind of touches on those issues?
There's some, and there's a paper, I think it's from the 90s, and I can't remember who wrote it, but it's on the list, and it's called something about conservation, a view from the global south. That's really good and talks about some of these issues, but I don't think that there's a lot of that. I think it's possible that I just don't know the literature that well, because like I said, this isn't, as much as I know that this is important to learn about, it's not directly my dissertation research, so it's mostly things that I've been reading in my own time.
This has got to be your dissertation research. You can write a whole thesis on this. Scrap your own plan, get on this one.
I'm involving it. I am going to work it into some of my work, but I could write a whole thesis on it, as you know. It could be my entire dissertation. So yeah, there is some work on that. I think that it's also becoming more, I think there's more coming out now. Again, it's possible that I just don't know, but there is a scholar, Jessica Hernandez, who I think just finished her PhD at University of Washington. Yeah, no, I know. Who is, she's written some work about this in Mexico. And I think she just edited an edition of a journal, and my mind is blank on which journal it was, but the entire journal was about, or the issue was about that specifically. And so I hope that that's starting to signal that it's becoming more common to talk about in the global north, to think about that.
Yeah, but I guess that's what I was asking. Yeah, because it seems that, unfortunately, but it is true that when it enters sort of that Western literature, that's kind of one of the hallmarks that it's become the mainstream, right? When it's kind of left that original literature. Yeah, and I was just wondering, I was curious if you'd already seen that. But
yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I was so excited when the list was translated into Spanish and French, because both of the people who are managing those lists are updating them with literature in that language. So it'll be a translation of the list that I wrote, but then they're also adding things that are in Spanish or in French. And so hopefully people who can read those languages will be able to explore that. But also it's important for people who cannot read those languages to learn about these issues as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah.